Starting off this list at our number 10 spot, we have Tommy Lynn Sells. Tommy Lynn Sells was an American serial killer who is responsible for 22 confirmed deaths, but authorities have said that they know there are more. I actually watched an interview that he did, and one of the aspects that scared me the most while watching him talk about his crimes is how you can tell that he committed these acts because he wanted to, and because he liked it. In the end, Tommy was caught because of someone who survived his attack in the most incredible way. She was able to go on and give such a good description of him that it led to his capture, and she was able to positively identify him. Not only did she save her own life, but who knows how many others. In the end, Tommy and his crimes were deemed so horrific that he received the death sentence and was executed on April 3rd, 2014. In our number 9 spot today, we have Sam Little. Sam Little is well known for being one of the worst serial killers ever. He has confessed to taking the lives of more than 90 people, and while authorities have only been able to definitively connect him to 30, they say they have no reason to doubt the validity of any of his other confessions. Sam was able to continue on his horrible path for so many years because of the fact that he committed these crimes in different states and different counties, which made it more difficult to connect these crimes to one another. In an interview with an investigator named Sergeant LeBlanc, as they discussed religious beliefs, they spoke about the nature of sin. Sam stated he had no fear of God and said that God made him this way, so why should he ask for forgiveness? He said that God knew everything he did. He also allegedly told a few select people that he believed he was the devil. In our number 8 spot today, we have Vincenzo Verzenni. Vincenzo lived from 1849 to 1918, and he was a serial killer who was nicknamed the Vampire of Bergamo. The first of his victims was found in 1870, and when authorities examined the body, they found bite marks on the neck, as well as certain parts of the body missing. The next of his victims he didn't end up taking the life of, but he tried to bite their neck. In 1872, there was the next body of one of his victims that was found, and it had all the strange and disturbing signs that the previous one had. After Vincenzo was arrested, he confessed to his crimes with the added detail that he also chose to drink the blood of his victims before leaving their bodies. Somehow, Vincenzo managed to escape the death penalty after a vote of sympathy from only one juror, and he instead was sentenced to life in an asylum. In our number 7 spot today, we have Daria Saltykova. Daria was a Russian noblewoman and serial killer from Moscow. She became well known for killing many of her serfs, mostly women. Because of her ties to the Russian royal court and other Russian nobility, complaints about the deaths at her estate were initially ignored and only resulted in punishments for those who did the complaining. Eventually, however, relatives of those who had been killed were able to bring a petition to Empress Catherine II, who then decided to try Daria publicly. Investigations took 6 long years where the investigating official counted up to 138 suspicious deaths, basically all of which could likely be attributed to Daria. In the end, she was found guilty of 38 of these crimes, but the Empress wasn't quite sure what the punishment should be, as the death penalty had already been abolished in Russia. In the end, Daria was chained on a public platform and made to wear a sign around her neck that detailed the crimes she committed. After this form of punishment, she was sent to jail to serve out her life sentence. In our number 6 spot today, we have Herta Oberhauser. Herta was a German physician and convicted war criminal who performed absolutely horrific medical atrocities on prisoners at Ravensbrück Women's Concentration Camp. She was known for being a part of medical experiments like treating purposely infected wounds with sulfonamide, as well as bone, muscle, and nerve regeneration and transplantation. Herta was the only female that was a defendant in the Nuremberg doctor trials, and she was convicted for crimes against humanity, but was only sentenced to 20 years in prison. She was released early for good behavior and ended up becoming a family doctor again in West Germany. That was, however, until a survivor recognized her. Herta then had her medical license revoked, and then she was fined. She tried to appeal, but was rejected and never practiced medicine again. I think we can all probably be grateful for that. In our number 5 spot today, we have Elizabeth Báthory. Elizabeth was a Hungarian noblewoman who lived from August of 1560 to August of 1614. While she was born into one of the oldest and most powerful families in Transylvania and was well educated and successful, she also was killing young women and bathing in their blood. Okay, buried the lead on that one, sorry about that. Elizabeth has gone down as one of the most evil women in history because she was taking the lives of women who were her servants, and she was bathing in their blood because she believed it would keep her young. there's something that's telling me that it probably didn't work. Anyway, instead of being remembered as youthful and beautiful, Elizabeth is instead remembered as being a terrible, evil person who took the lives of somewhere from 175 to 200 women, but some accounts swear the number might be as high as 600. In our number 4 spot today, we have Charles Cullen. This guy used to be a nurse who took the lives of his patients throughout his career, and he may be one of the worst serial killers ever recorded. He confessed to taking the lives of 40 people, but through subsequent interviews, it became apparent that the number was way higher than 40. He just couldn't remember the names of them all. But he could, of course, remember the details of his crimes against them. His crimes started in 1988 and spanned over a decade into 2003. In October of 2003, when a patient at a hospital passed away from low blood sugar, the authorities were called. This person was Charles' final victim, and authorities began looking into him and investigating his past employment history. On December 12, 2003, authorities were arresting him and charging him with only one count of his crimes, but he ended up admitting to 40. He ended up pleading guilty to his crimes and arranged a plea deal where authorities would not seek the death penalty if he cooperated. During one of his court proceedings, he continuously asked the judge to step down and apparently repeatedly chanted, quote, "Your Honor, you need to step down for 25 minutes straight," even after he was restrained and gagged for his outbursts. It is thought that his victims might be up in the 400 range, which is truly unbelievable. Charles was sentenced to 18 consecutive life sentences and will be eligible for parole in 2403. In our number 3 spot today, we have Charles Manson. While there are a ton of evil people on this list today, Charles is likely one of the most famous for the absolute worst reasons. Manson was released from prison in 1967, where he then moved to San Francisco, and that's where he gained a small following that would eventually go on to be the cult known as the Family. The group eventually moved to an abandoned ranch outside of Los Angeles, and it was here that Manson continued to brainwash his followers and manipulate them with his own religious philosophies. Manson claimed that there would be an upcoming race war in which white people would be killed, which was intended to instill fear in his followers. This was so that he could ignite a race war and send his followers on a killing spree, which did end up being the night of the horrible Tate and LaBianca killings. This led to a reign of terror in the Los Angeles area for several months because people just couldn't understand how or why this happened. In our number 2 spot today, we have Randy Kraft. Also known as the Scorecard Killer, Randy is a monster who took the lives of at least 16 young men between 1972 and 1983. The Scorecard nickname comes from how, after his arrest, police found a coded list that contained cryptic references to his crimes and the victims. On May 14, 1983, 2 California Highway Patrol officers observed a car driving erratically and suspected the driver may be impaired, so they pulled it over. Once the car pulled over, Randy Kraft got out and identified himself and subsequently failed all field sobriety tests. At the same time, the other officer went over to the passenger's side where he sadly found Randy's final victim, 25-year-old Marine Terry Lee Gambrell. The next 2 days of investigation revealed the horrors of what Kraft had done, and on May 16, 1983, he was formally charged with the one crime, but many more charges came in the next months. His trial first began on September 26, 1988, and on August 11, 1989, the jury rendered a verdict of death, and the sentence was upheld. As of this year, he still remains on death row at San Quentin State Prison, where he continues to deny any responsibility for the crimes. Like they didn't find one of the victims in the passenger seat of his car. In our number 1 spot today, we have Peter Tobin. Peter Tobin is a serial killer who was convicted for 3 separate crimes, but it is believed his crimes may actually be up in the range of 40 to 50. Before being convicted of these crimes, Peter also served another 10-year prison sentence for other crimes committed, and he was released from prison for those crimes in 2004. 3 years later, however, he was sentenced to life with a minimum of 21 years for taking the life of Angelica Kluk in 2006. After this, remains of 2 more people who went missing in 1991 were found in his former home, and he was also tried for these crimes, which ended up solidifying his sentence to a whole life order, which means he will never be up for parole. There are some who believe Tobin is responsible for more unsolved crimes, and he has been labeled a psychopath by a senior psychologist. Apparently, while in prison, he has boasted about taking the lives of 48 people, despite the fact that he's only officially been linked to 3. So hopefully at some point we'll be able to actually confirm those other crimes that he's been talking about. Starting off at our number 10 spot, we have Scott Lee Kimball. This is a man who took the lives of at least 4 people between the years of 2003 and 2004, but I say the words "at least" because although it's never been proven, it is thought that he actually took the lives of somewhere around 20 plus people. During the first of the 2 crime-filled years, Scott actually worked as an FBI informant, but to none of our surprise now, he was one of the worst informants of all time. Not only did he rarely provide any sort of evidence that ended up being useful, but much of the evidence he did provide ended up later being proven false. He was caught in 2006 not only for these horrific crimes, but many others as well, which included things like fraud and forgery. He ended up being sentenced to 70 years in prison, and he still is currently serving that sentence. In our number 9 spot today, we have Maxim Petrov. Maxim was a Russian doctor who ended up being arrested in 2000. He was arrested for taking the lives of 17 people in just 1 year, which is so many. He did this through administering a sort of lethal drug combination. He didn't stop there though, because that would just be regular terrible. Instead, he then went on to rob his victims, and then he would set fire to their homes, which I assume would likely be to hide any evidence of his wrongdoings. So all in all, just a real awful human being. In the end, he was caught, he stood trial, and was convicted to a life sentence. In the end, Maxim was believed to have committed 19 of these crimes, but he was only tried for 17 of them and was found guilty on 11 of the charges. In our number 8 spot today, we have Gary Ridgway. This horrible human being is also sometimes known as the Green River Killer, and his crimes took place somewhere between 1982 to potentially as recent as 2001. He was convicted for 49 crimes, but confessed to an unbelievable 71, which makes him the second most prolific serial killer in the United States in terms of confirmed killings. Most of his victims were women in vulnerable circumstances, and through DNA profiling evidence in 2001, authorities were able to connect him to 4 of his crimes. From there, they made a deal with him where they would spare him the death sentence in exchange for the disclosure of the location of all of the missing women. Gary took the deal and was spared a death sentence, and instead was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Not only did he say that he chose the type of victims he did because they were, quote, easy to pick, and that he, quote, hated most of them, but he also called his crimes his career. So all in all, just a horrible person. In our number 7 spot today, we have Lynn, who started his life in jail in the early 1990s, and he was there as a result of human trafficking charges. Not a good start for sure, but this clearly did not stop him, as he decided, while still in jail, to start his own medical practice. Okay, didn't know it was that easy, but anyway. In 1997, after a retrial, Hu actually ended up being released from prison. Okay, so what's he gonna do with his newfound freedom? Well, he decided to just keep doing the thing he was doing in jail, which was running a sort of medical practice. You might be sitting there asking yourself, is he a doctor or some kind of medical practitioner? The answer is no. So for the next few years, Hu treated many people with an herbal remedy that actually contained sodium sulfate, which is lethal in large doses. It is suspected that because of this, he ended up taking the lives of about 146 people. He was arrested again in 1999 and was sentenced to 15 years in prison for practicing medicine without a license. Yeah, only 15 years. And then he was released early for good behavior. Shortly after his release in 2014, it is believed he was responsible for another death of a 22-year-old student. So at this point, I just don't even know. I don't know what to make of that. It's terrible. In our number 6 spot today, we have Viktor Sayenko. This terrible person is just one part of a group that is responsible for a string of killings in Ukraine that took place in June and July of 2007. In the end, he was charged with 29 separate incidents, 21 of which were killings, and the rest were incidents where the victims thankfully survived the horrendous attacks. Aside from just how tremendously terrible this entire thing was, the case gained a certain notoriety because of the fact that there was actually actually a recording of one of the crimes that leaked online. That is because the people committing these acts had intended to sell the videos of them being done, which is thought to be the biggest motivation for all of the crimes, but it has never been proven. In the end, he was found guilty of these crimes and is currently serving a life sentence. In our number 5 spot today, we have Robert Pickton. This horrible person is one of the worst Canadians to ever live and is one of our country's worst serial killers. Pickton dropped out of school and began working at his family's pig farm, and this is where most of his absolutely horrific crimes took place. He was first arrested in 2002 and was convicted in 2007 of taking the lives of 6 people, but throughout an extremely lengthy investigation, evidence of many more came to light. During his time in jail, an undercover police officer posed as his cellmate, and Pickton confessed to 49 crimes to him. Apparently, he was saying to the undercover officer that he wanted to take one more life to make it an even 50, and that he only got caught because he was sloppy. The entire trial was a bit of a mess, but it led to a life sentence without the possibility of parole for 25 years, which is the longest possible sentence under Canadian law at that time. This unfortunately does mean that he will be eligible for parole within the next decade, so let's hope that never happens ever. In our number 4 spot today, we have Robert Hansen. He is one of the most prolific serial killers in Alaska's history because for over a decade, he would kidnap women and bring them into the wilderness where he would then stalk them like prey. The reason he got away with his crimes for so long is because outside of these horrifying crimes, he was just a soft-spoken baker. Robert was heading to church by day and prowling strip clubs at night looking for the next person to take. What led to the downfall of this horrible monster was a badass named Cindy Polson, who was able to escape from Robert and was sure to leave evidence behind. She then went to authorities and told them what happened, and this led to a search warrant for Robert's property, which is where all the evidence they needed lied. Robert is believed to have taken the lives of at least 17 women, and in 1983 he was sentenced to 461 years and a life sentence without the possibility of parole. In our number 3 spot today, we have Catherine Burney. Back in the 1980s, Catherine and her husband David decided to go on a little spree that would see them taking the lives of 4 separate women. The pair would together kidnap the women, bring them back to their home where the rest of the crimes would take place. In the end, the pair was caught due to their 5th victim, who thankfully was able to escape. She went right to the police and was able to lead them directly to the home of these terrible people. Both of these 2 were sentenced to 4 terms of life in prison, and based on laws at the time, this meant that they had to serve at least 20 years before being eligible for parole. In 2005, David ended up taking his own life in jail, and while Catherine has applied for parole a few times, in 2009 it was determined that she will never be allowed to be released, making her only the 3rd female in Australian history to have her papers marked this way. In our number 2 spot today, we have Robledo Puch. This man is a serial killer from Argentina who is said to be responsible for taking the lives of 11 people, as well as a series of robberies, kidnapping, and more terrible things that we can't even talk about here on YouTube. In the end, because of a blunder in the middle of a crime where he not only killed his own accomplice, but then failed to remove his own identification from his now dead accomplice's pocket, thus basically placing him at the scene of the crime, he ended up being caught and arrested. He ended up being sentenced to life in prison. These crimes took place in 1972, and while he did become eligible for parole in 2000, he still remains in jail to this day and is one of the longest serving prisoners in Argentina ever. In our number 1 spot today, we have Adnan Kolak. This Turkish serial killer is responsible for taking the lives of 11 women who were between the ages of 68 and 95. He also was responsible for 6 other crimes that were against elderly women, so really just the worst of the worst. Anyway, he ended up being caught for his crimes and was sentenced to 6 death sentences as well as 40 years in prison. This was back in 1995 when he was first sentenced, but in 2004 the death penalty in Turkey was abolished, which then commuted his sentence to life in prison. I truly wish this was where the story ended, but it is not. No, instead, in May of 2005, Adnan was actually released from jail. I wish I was joking, but that would be a very weird joke to make, and unfortunately it's just the truth. There was some sort of conditional release agreement that was called the Rasan Amnesty, so somehow this guy just got released. I don't know. Again, I hate it. It happens, and I don't know what to do about it, okay? Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have Kenneth Bianchi. The Hillside Strangler, which was later found out to be a pair of cousins working together, were Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono Jr. The two were charged and convicted for harming and taking the lives of 10 separate women together, with Kenneth taking the lives of 2 others on his own. After an extremely intensive investigation and the arrest of the two, Kenneth began trying to set up an insanity defense. He claimed dissociative identity disorder. He blamed his alter ego Steve for the horrific multitude of crimes. Luckily, however, a court psychologist, Dr. Martin Orn, observed him and his behavior and found that his claims were untrue. After being presented with this finding, Kenneth agreed to plead guilty and testify against his cousin in exchange for leniency on his sentence. He still ended up being sentenced to life in prison, while his cousin got a sentence of life in prison without parole. While Angelo had a heart attack and passed in 2002, Kenneth still remains in prison. In our number 9 spot today, we have Warren Jeffs. Warren Jeffs is the president of the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ and the Latter-day Saints, and is also serving a life plus 20-year sentence, which is exactly where he should be. His father was once the president of the cult, but when he passed, the position was passed on to Warren. As the new leader of the polygamous cult, he said that no one should even attempt to marry one of his father's widows, but just a few days later he himself married all of them except for 2, because one refused and then was banned from ever marrying anyone ever again, and the other ran away. If your marriage proposal causes someone to flee the cult that they're in, you're clearly not a very good person. Warren had the power to assign who would marry who, but he was also able to punish a man by taking his wives and children and assigning them to another man. As a man, you had to have at least 3 wives in order to get into heaven, they say, but the more wives, the more likely it would be that you got into heaven. In 2005, the Texas authorities conducted a raid and took legal custody of 416 children after someone called in and tipped them off about all of the horrible things that were happening at the ranch. In 2006, Warren was arrested for being the worst and is still serving his sentence. There is so much more to this case that we don't have time to cover, but there was a documentary released recently called Keep Sweet, Pray and Obey, which I would fully recommend if you want to know more about this horrible person. In our number 8 spot today, we have Tex Watson. Tex Watson was one of the central members of the Manson family, which was led by Charles Manson, and he was a willing participant for the horrible Tate and LaBianca crimes that took place on August 9th and 10th, 1969. If you don't know about them, you can look them up, but just a warning that the events that took place on those nights were horrible, gruesome, and insanely unnecessary. In October of 1969, Tex knew his arrest was coming, so he fled to his home state of Texas, but was later arrested and extradited back to California. Once he was in California, he refused to talk or eat and ended up losing 55 pounds, which got him sent to get tested to see if he was fit to stand trial, which he was. In 1971, he was convicted on 7 counts related to the killings that happened on those terrible nights. He originally received a death sentence, but it did end up being commuted to life in prison. But get this, you guys, he was able to release a book while in prison, and he got married, and through conjugal visits he was able to have 4 children. Thankfully, in 1996 they banned those kinds of visits for people serving life in prison, and in 2003 he did get divorced because his wife had met someone else, which, like, yeah, I would hope so. He also apparently is now a devout Christian, which is just interesting. In our number 7 spot today, we have the Golden State Killer. If you have any interest in true crime at all, you have most definitely heard of the Golden State Killer, as he was one of the most famous serial killers of all time, and he managed to elude police for 30 years. From 1973 to 1986, the GSK was responsible for taking the lives of 13 people, harming 50, and 120 different burglaries all across California. Throughout the investigation process, he used different tactics to both taunt and threaten police and victims, which is just on another level of messed up. If you don't know how this story ends, buckle up because it is absolutely wild. So you know those family DNA tests, like those 23andMe things where you send in your DNA and then they send you back your genealogy? Well, basically these services helped identify who the real GSK was. In 2018, when Detective Paul Holes, shout out to MFM if you know you know, and FBI lawyer Steve Kramer uploaded the GSK DNA profile that they were able to obtain from the crime scenes to the website GED Maps, match, they were able to find 10 to 20 people who had the same great-great-great-grandparents as the match. From there, a genealogist made a large family tree, and then they were able to single out 2 main suspects. After covertly connecting DNA samples from one of the suspects and comparing them to the crime scene DNA, they were finally able to arrest Joseph James DeAngelo, who is the Golden State Killer. After decades of waiting, the victims of his crimes were finally able to see justice served as he was sentenced to 12 life sentences plus 8 years. He was spared the death penalty because he admitted to numerous crimes he had perpetrated, some of which he wasn't even being charged for. He is now 75 years old, and he will most certainly spend the rest of his life in prison. In our number 6 spot today, we have James Holmes. James is the man behind the 2012 Aurora, Colorado shooting that took the lives of 12 people and injured 70 others in the Century 16 movie theater. Shortly after the crime spree, he was arrested and held without bail while he awaited trial on an accepted plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. I just want to make it clear in this case that insanity doesn't apply to every mental illness, of course. James was and is severely mentally ill, but the court has the job of deciding whether or not that illness made him unable to tell right from wrong. That's what the defense had to prove. Things were admitted to the court, such as his notebooks and journals, as well as testimony from 2 separate psychologists who spent 22 and 25 hours with him, and both diagnosed him with a serious mental illness, but both also stated that in their professional opinion, he knew right from wrong. After a really tumultuous trial, he ended up being found guilty. The jury could have given him a death sentence, but on account of his illness, they decided that that would be inappropriate, so in the end instead he was sentenced to 12 life sentences without parole and an additional 3,318 years. In our number 5 spot today, we have Charles Ng. Charles' story really starts off shortly after he moved to the United States on a student visa. He dropped out after his first semester, and soon after he was involved in a hit-and-run accident. He then tried to avoid prosecution by enlisting in the United States Marine Corps using false documents that stated his birthplace was within the United States. He was later arrested by military police a year later for stealing automatic weapons, and then somehow he escaped custody, headed back toward Northern California, and this is where he met Leonard Lake, who is another real piece of work. Charles did end up going away and serving a bit of time, but it was only 18 months and he was back with Leonard, and that is when the two started their crime spree together. It is believed that together the pair took the lives of somewhere from 11 to 25 different people. When Leonard was caught and brought in for questioning, he sneakily took a cyanide pill he had hidden in his jacket and took his own life, but Charles ended up standing trial. He was convicted for 11 of the killings, and he remains on death row at San Quentin. In our number 4 spot today, we have Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka. This is a double whammy because unfortunately both of these people are still alive, but at least one of them, Paul, is still in jail. This horrible pair are often referred to as the Ken and Barbie killers, and while Paul started off living a life of crime, he quickly brought Karla into it as well after their meeting. That is not to say she is not just as guilty as him, however, because they are both fully responsible for their own actions. While Paul was arrested for a multitude of crimes, the pair were arrested and convicted of taking the lives of 3 separate people, one of them being Karla's own sister. See what I mean about them both being responsible for their own crimes? They both suck. The investigation into the crimes proved to be quite difficult, with authorities having plenty of hoops to jump through, and this is why a plea deal was created for Karla. She had 1 week to accept or decline the deal, which would give her a sentence of 12 years for her full cooperation. She accepted. Both were convicted in 2005, and Paul was up to apply for parole in 2018, and in October of that year he was denied. His next parole hearing was just over a year ago, on June 22nd of 2021, and it took only an hour of deliberation to decide to turn down that application as well. I personally think 30 seconds probably would have been enough to decide, but I'm just glad the outcome was the same. Karla, on the other hand, served her 12-year sentence and then was released. Like, years ago. She moved away from Canada and headed to Costa Rica for a while with her new husband and children, if you can believe that, but unfortunately she has since returned. In our number 3 spot today, we have Edmund Kemper. Edmund Kemper is an American killer who was convicted for taking the lives of 10 people, including his paternal grandparents, as well as his own mother. It is said that he is noted for his height, as he is 6 foot 9 inches, and for his intelligence, as he apparently has an IQ of 145, but I personally think he is most notable for being an absolute monster. His first crime took place when he took the lives of his grandparents, and after this crime he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and spent time in a hospital before it was determined that he was rehabilitated and he was released at the age of 21. After his release, he unfortunately went on a spree where he would target young females who were hitchhiking. After his final crimes, he ended up confessing and turning himself in, which is something we really don't see all of the time. When asked in an interview why he confessed, he said, quote, "The original purpose was gone. It wasn't serving any physical or real or emotional purpose. It was just a pure waste of time." 3 court-appointed psychiatrists examined and observed him and found him to be legally sane, and thus he was able to stand trial. On November 8, 1973, the jury deliberated for just 5 hours before returning with a verdict of guilty. He has been eligible for parole since 1979 and has been denied every time he applied, one time saying, quote, "Society is not ready in any shape or form for me. I can't fault them for that." He is eligible to apply for parole again next in 2024. In our number 2 spot today, we have Stephen Griffiths. This is a person who is said to have idolized the Yorkshire Ripper, so I'm sure what comes next will be no surprise. Stephen was a PhD student who wanted to achieve fame, but through the most sinister way possible. Between June 2009 and May of 2010, he would go on to take the lives of 3 separate women. His criminal history was also extremely concerning, as years ago he had been arrested due to an unprovoked attack on a grocery store manager, and it is said that he previously stated that he saw himself becoming a serial killer. Shortly after he was arrested for his crimes, CCTV footage emerged that shows him celebrating after taking the life of his final victim. The footage showed him holding up a crossbow and giving the finger directly to the camera. It is said that Stephen pled guilty to his crimes once caught, not because he was remorseful, but because he wanted to receive the recognition for them. In our number 1 spot today, we have Joanna Denny. This is a person responsible for a series of killings and attacks that took place in March 2013. Joanna is a very cold and heartless person and has, on many occasions, been said to laugh at her crimes and the lives she took, even still behind bars. After the first of her crimes, authorities launched a manhunt for her, and they used CCTV footage to help track her down. She was finally caught after attacking 2 dog walkers who, thanks to immediate medical intervention, were able to survive. There are many things about this story that make it exceptionally chilling, and it seems as though most people Joanna encounters are left with quite an impression of what a horrible person she is. On the day she was sentenced, it is reported that the judge, Mr. Justice Spencer, said, quote, "Although you pleaded guilty, you've made it clear you have no remorse." He went on to say, quote, "You are a cruel, calculating, selfish, and manipulative serial killer." After this, he sentenced her to a whole life order, or life in prison without parole, and it is said that she smiled and laughed at this. Since her time in prison, she is said to have planned escape attempts that involved the killing of a prison guard and other terrifying ideas.